Hey everybody, I just got home from one of my big chain pet stores and I brought home some guppies. That was going to be the topic of today's video, but I had an experience while I was in the store. I got some really bad advice after having been given some grief about what I was going to do with my guppies, etc. And just the whole experience, I just feel like is worthy of a video. Not because I'm trying to bash anybody, not because I'm trying to say one big chain store is worse than the other or anything like that. In fact, I'm not even going to name what store it was. It doesn't matter. I just feel there's a lesson here. And the lesson I would take away from this is just because somebody sounds like they know what they're talking about at one of your big chain pet stores doesn't necessarily mean they do, first of all, and secondly, their job is to sell you fish. Their job is not to give these fish a good home or anything like that. It's to sell fish. It's to make sure fish go home with people. And so I found this whole scenario sort of weird. So what happens is I walk in, I go in to the fish section, the person comes up, may I help you? I said, well, I'm looking at some guppies. And they said, well, how big is your tank? And I said, well, I got a lot of tanks. I said, one, or whatever. I said, I have a lot of tanks. He's like, okay, well, and then he's like, so what fish are these guppies going to be mixed with? And I said, I don't know. And he's like, you don't know? And then he's like, well, how big is the tank they're going in? And I was like, I don't know. And he's looking at me like I'm an idiot. And I finally said, look, I'm taking these guppies home. I'm going to put them in a quarantine tank. And then I'll put them in a tank that I want later when I'm ready to put them in a tank. Like, what are you trying to ask me? And he's like, oh, well, I just wanted to know what size tank you were putting them in to make sure they were compatible and everything. But that sounds like, that should be okay. And I'm like, okay, these are guppies. I'm buying guppies. Who cares what size tank I'm putting them in? A 5-gallon tank would be fine for guppies. What do you need a size limit? So he gives me all this grief about that. And of course, I also realize this guy doesn't know me from Adam. So he has no idea that I have all these tanks and I have experience and know what I'm doing and everything. So I probably lost my patience a little more than I should have. But right after that, once I got my guppies, I asked if they had any rubber lip or clown plecos. I specifically said I need a small fish that's going in a 20-gallon tank. And they were like, well, what do you want it for? I said, because I want a clown pleco or a rubber lip pleco. And they said, well, do you want it like as an algae eater? Are you looking for an algae eater? I said, well, it'll do its job while it's in there, but I always like to have a small, catfish, and sometimes I use a cory or something. I just, I'm looking for a clown pleco or, a rubber lip for this 20-gallon tank. And he actually recommended to me, they didn't have any of those, but why don't you take one of these? And he actually recommended that I take home a Chinese algae eater. After just telling him it was for a 20-gallon tank, he tells me to take home a Chinese algae eater. The last one of those I had was in this 125-gallon tank. Now, I'll grant you it didn't need to be in a tank that big, but they get 9 inches long in an aquarium. They get even bigger than that out in the wild. But mine was probably close to 9 inches long when it died after about 6 or 7 years. And it started out in a small tank as an algae eater. They then moved to my 55 because it grew like a weed. It became aggressive. It killed 2 of my angelfish, and after it killed 2 of my angelfish is when it ended up in this tank. And this is what I'm being told to take home to put in my 20-gallon tank from the same person that a moment ago was dragging me over the coals as to where I was going to put the guppies I was taking home. So remember, I don't think this person meant any harm or was trying to be a know-it-all or arrogant. I'm sure they meant well, but they were working within the parameters of the training they got. A friend of mine and I were talking the other day about, people that are trained in these different products or whatever. I've been around retail long enough to know what product training involves. It doesn't mean you're an expert. It doesn't mean you use this product in your own life and you know the ins and outs and the little quirks about it. It means you've been told, well, it does this, it does that, it does the other. It's the same stuff that's written on the side of the package. In fact, I've even been in pet stores and I've asked people, well, what about this fish? How big does this fish get? And then they squint and they start reading the little card on the bottom. I can do that. I can read the card on the tank. If that's what you're doing, go away. I don't need your help. I'm trying to get the opinion of somebody that knows what they're talking about. But again, that's the kind of training these people get. And again, no shame on them or it's a job. They're there to sell a product. They're not in there because of the passion of fish hobby and so on and so forth. They're employees at a store, and this is the way the store is run. They are probably given a little bit of authority to deny people certain fish if they're taking them home to wrong scenarios, but I can tell you from secondhand experience, I've talked to a lot of people over the years that have said, yeah, and you do that too often and your manager's going to get rid of you. They say that to you, but your job is to sell fish. And so, again, this guy probably didn't really know what he's talking about. He's just been trained that these little tiny algae eaters are great algae eaters. When somebody's looking for an algae eater, you recommend these because they're algae eaters. It even says so in the name. It's an algae eater. And so it's not his fault. It's his training. Again, you're buying something from a store whose, you know, their whole idea is to make profit off this stuff, is to sell stuff. Again, they're not doing this out of the love for fish. They're not trying to rehome these fish into caring households. They probably love it when you kill fish because that means you got to come back and buy more. So, again, the only point to this story is just don't assume that because somebody sounds like they know what they're talking about and they're throwing around authority and so on and so forth that they necessarily do know what they're talking about. So when you're going to a fish store, if you're not really sure what you want to get or you're not really sure how this fish is going to work out, go home, do a little bit of research, look into it, and go back and get it later. I know that's really hard to do, but do that, or whip out your phone, look it up or something like that. Asking the employee at the big chain pet store is probably not your best idea. I know they mean well, I know they're trained and they think they know what they're talking, but they're trained in ways that are designed to move fish and sell fish and whatever, and that was a perfect example of it, is giving me a bunch of grief about where my guppies are going to go and then recommending a Chinese algae eater for a 20-gallon tank. So buyer beware. When you go into these big chain stores, remember, their job is to sell you fish, and a lot of people are going to act like they know what they're talking about and all that stuff, but go in there armed with your own information. Try to avoid impulse purchases. If you are somebody like me who does make occasional impulse purchases, remember, I kind of have a little experience. I sort of know what to do with certain types of fish. I have a lot of variety of tanks I can put them in, and worst case scenario, if they don't work out at all, I always have options of places and fish stores that will take fish back from me, either in a return form or I can just sell them straight out to other fish stores. So I got a little more playing around room as far as, you know, buying these sort of impulse purchases. But if you're going to one of these stores and you're relying on what they're telling you, then you may be getting yourself into some trouble, because they commonly recommend these Chinese algae eaters for 10 and 20-gallon tanks, and that's ridiculous. They should not be allowed to do that, but there you go. So buyer beware. All right, everybody, that's all I got for you today. I would be interested to hear any similar stories or anything that you've had experiences like that. Don't forget that I do a live stream every Friday night and Sunday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. So thanks for watching this one, and I will see you real soon in the next one.